Hello, Bill.
Hello, Sandy.
Are you feeling as unwell as I feel?
Maybe slightly less, but yes, I am feeling unwell and may have a coughing fit here or there. Um, but back from a trip to the old Isles where I got to see
What
all of my friends.
what old isles are you talking about, Bill?
I'm talking about the United Kingdom.
Oh,
Yeah. Next time I'll make a point to see you at some point.
anyway, in case you do have a coughing fit, you are
Yes.
legitimately poorly. And in case my voice breaks, squeaks, comes, goes, it's because I've got COVID. I blame you, Bill Wadman.
How do you blame me? I wasn't anywhere near you when you got COVID.
Anyway, man up.
Yes. Do you take offense to that term? Does that term spark anger in you?
It does a bit, yeah.
Okay.
And the reason why we're talking about man up this evening is because I was wondering, often when you say to me that I have a very feminine or female perspective, and that I like feminine things, I wonder if you ever reflect on that and realize that that could be taken in one way as an offense, maybe in another way I could see it as something maybe flattering, whichever
Wait,
way.
hold on a second. When I say that to you, I say it because you refer to the things you're talking about as feminine. And then I generally want to know what you mean by feminine.
Sometimes, but you have also now, I've sometimes felt slipped into a sense that it's a diminishing descriptor.
Yeah. Well, see, it's interesting that you take it as a diminishing descriptor when I don't think I've ever used it as a diminishing descriptor.
Well,
That says a lot about
that's why
society
we're
too,
talking
doesn't it?
about it, because we're going to talk
Yeah.
about it around the other way.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean,
yeah, man
mostly
up.
things that would be described as masculine, I would not take offense at somebody complaining about. I don't think of myself as a particularly masculine person.
But is that because you have conditions on the word? Yeah.
Maybe.
I mean, what does it mean to be a man?
I think aggression is part of it. I think strong is part of it. Um, I think decisive. I mean, I think these are the words that people would tend to use as saying that they're masculine traits.
Well, what are the words you would use?
I mean, I would go with all of those. I just don't particularly subscribe to those in my own life, especially the aggression part of it. I don't like fighting. I'm a lover, not a fighter.
Ever.
What? Except for here on
I
this
find
show.
this very interesting because we each do have a kind of value on words like masculine, feminine, male, and female. And no matter how much it seems, at least, I speak to people of all different um, standings on their own sense of gender or um, people who have very particular and defined sense of gender are antagonized perhaps by notions of gender. There's lots of different people I meet who seem to have some kind of issue with what gender might mean. And I think
Sure.
the problem might arise because we don't ever really discuss what gender means to us as individuals. And when we do, there's a great deal of fear around how our interpretation of certain words or values it might make us seem, and we've kind of touched on this before, it's very, very problematic in many ways for, you've said yourself, a middle class, middle aged white male to talk about very much
without making somebody angry.
without making someone angry. I wonder about it. Anyway.
I mean, go ahead. You can go ahead. I mean, I think it's also interesting to imagine, you know, it's what, I'm going to put this in scare quotes, society says are gender traits and what individuals believe are those gender traits, and how much of them are innate and how much of them are learned and how much of it is, you know, society dictating these things, or how much of this is different sexes expressing things in different ways. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. I don't like gender stereotypes for sure.
Well, I mean, do we do anything but stereotype? And also through the epitomization of the masculine in art and art history, you know, what's actually being dealt with. I find it fascinating. There's so much inquiry now around or into what it means to be female, the male gaze upon the female form. There are thousands of documents that we could read. There are many examples that we could explore where the kind of the role of the female in art has been deconstructed. But it's so interesting that though we might say that art is dominated by men, when we actually look at what masculinity is within art, like, what is it?
Well, it's interesting because I think that if art has been dominated by men, I mean, when we talk about femininity in art, we tend to talk about feminine subjects within art, and to a certain extent, female artists and their intentions, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that while there are examples, yeah, but Michelangelo also, is, from what we can kind of gather, was probably gay. So I'm just saying that the subjects that the subjects that a lot of male artists were using, I think male artists would tend to rather make art about females than males. So if art was dominated by men, there was probably a lot more females subjects in art over the years.
But when we look at, you know, classical sculpture,
sure, which this is almost like a neo example of.
Well, yes, it is, and I mean, there's elements of kind of contrapposto placement of the foot, the imbalance of the weight, that absolutely harked to the conventions of kind of classical sculpture. Absolutely, Michelangelo would have been aware of all of those things, and and
did them better, by the way.
However, in looking at art about the masculine, do we know it when we see it? Is it enough that the masculine is represented through the form of what we think of as male? And when that becomes subverted or changed somehow, do we still have enough to kind of hang our awareness or perception of what is masculine onto those things, whether they are unobvious or not? I mean, this to me, is this an obviously masculine piece of art?
It's funny because, okay, yes, obviously it's a male subject and it's a nude. And David is about to go to war, right? This is supposedly before he fights, right? So all of that is sort of like this is this sort of you know, there's this myth of violence, right? That, you know, the greatest people are only use power, physical force when they have to, when they absolutely have to. There's sort of this morality around it, right? And I feel like, you know, it was a just war, this kind of stuff. This is an example of, well, you know what, this is what David has to do to protect, you know, to fight back in a situation that he's going to lose, right? Or everyone assumed he was going to lose. So I look at this, and while so many of the things about it are very stereotypically masculine in the sense that it's a naked man, there's also this sort of placidity in this where it is very still. It's like a beat between waiting and action or something. Like there's like something about this moment that it just kind of sits there. And I don't see that moment feeling particularly, it's inactive, which I don't see as particularly masculine. Does that make sense?
Mm.
You know, I think if Bernini made this, he would have been whipping, you know, the sling.
I mean, Michelangelo wasn't the first person to be kind of awarded this lump of marble.
Sure, this is the one with the flaws and no one else wanted it and whatnot, right?
But also, I mean, it took almost like 30 years, I think, to come into his studio, to come into his care. It passed through the hands of two other sculptors previously, and it was sort of the process of David emerging. You know, it says, you know, you can read widely about this. You know, it took a lot for David to actually happen. It took a lot for it to come to Michelangelo to create David. And there are lots of things technically about the sculpture that, you know, show that there are the hands of others in the completed form. But I love the idea that there's this moment of pause, and in that moment of pause, there's something entirely universal.
Yeah.
I also, though, know, as you will do, that this is very much a political statement. At the time of its unveiling, it was hugely contentious. People who were kind of anti-Medici would pelt it with stuff, and it's got a history actually of causing quite a lot of controversy, or certainly inciting people to react to it, not always favorably.
I mean, people in David versus Goliath sort of stories.
Yes, and that's the irony, isn't it? But all the time coming back to this idea that, you know, is it quite as antagonizing because of its innate masculinity, which stands for and is the symbol for enormous power of something that is of incredible value, and would an equivalent statue, if there could be such a thing, of a female form incite the same feelings of hostility or of reverence? And actually, I think that's quite a good question to ask. I asked myself.
Well, there's things like Winged Victory at the Louvre and that kind of stuff that I think are similar-ish kind of things.
Yes, I know. I mean, but nonetheless, are we feeling that that is actually an embodiment of femininity?
Do you see this as a masculine piece?
I
feel like it's got a little bit of both.
Yes, and I think that's why it's an interesting thing, because it's so familiar. David is such a familiar form to us. Widely reproduced, seen on a million postcards. Anyone who's ever been to Florence will have seen David, even if they haven't been into l'Accademia. They will have been in the square
where the fake one is.
Yeah. So they would have been up to Piazzale, Michelangelo, and seen the bronze. So there are lots of versions, even in Florence, of this. But he is a symbol. And it's whether he's a symbol of masculinity or if he's a symbol of something else, and whether in that something else there's an element of it requiring a masculine weighting in order to give it the gravitas as a piece of work that it has had across all these centuries.
It's funny because I see it as very masculine with like a tinge of femininity, which allows it to be an ideal version of masculinity. It's like, it's not pure masculinity. It's, as you were saying, sort of universal. And that makes it even more perfect.
But I wonder if, and this is where I have to be so careful because I don't want to cause offense to anyone. I wonder if your interpretation of this is something that is not entirely masculine, is less to do with it in any way being universal, but more to do with there being a sense of, I don't know, the homoerotic in it, or something that's more to do with sexuality than to do with gender.
Sure. I think that a lot of all of that is a permeable barrier. these things overlap.
Mm. I mean, much as there's been a movement to kind of redress a historical lack of female artists and art by women about women's concerns. There's also been a movement, I think, in this century to start more specifically looking at the male. Again,
can we
perhaps
hold on for 1 second? Do you think that the majority of art that was dominated by men for hundreds of years has a male, is about maleness? In the same way that you're saying there are more female artists talking about feminine themes, do you see the whole of, canon Western art that is male dominated as being male themed?
I don't know that I'm saying it's male themed, but that the latent male in most art that has been given a platform over the last 700 years.
Wait, what does latent male mean?
Like the fact is that it's made by men for men to see. So okay, even if it's not expressly about this is about being a man or this is about masculinity, nonetheless, there's always a presence of the male in the work, in the same way you and I might talk about there always being a presence of the artist in anything the artist might make. If that presence is male, I wonder, on a like sliding scale, simply the artist being male, does it make the work masculine in some way? Does it masculinize what is then available to be interpreted or perceived by the viewer?
I would lean towards no. But okay, I will listen to you.
But no, this is why I think this kind of work becomes quite interesting, is that actually there's been a dearth of exploration really about masculinity. If we're
yes, looking, I agree.
If we're looking at how art has recorded culture, art has recorded the culture of men objectifying women, right?
Sure.
That maybe we could say in a very kind of condensed way, that is like a masculine more. It's something that has been done by men for men's pleasure. But is it actually inquiring into what it means to be a man? Does it look carefully and scrutinize what masculinity actually is?
But our masculinity and femininity in art, let's assume for the moment that this person in this photograph, we're taking him as, I don't know, example of maleness, masculineness, right?
Right.
Does this actually tell us anything about what the artist or the subject feel about masculinity, or is it just a mirror of what society says masculinity is?
Well, the thing I find interesting with this, which is just a little bit of context about what we're looking at. Edward from Study of Self. Study of Self is a book work by Paul McDonald, who's a British-born but Australia-based photographer, and he got his master's, I think, from somewhere in London. A good qualification, obviously. Quite a sort of significant contemporary photographer working now. He teaches. He is described as socially engaged as an artist and photographer, and he particularly explores themes of masculinity and mental health, right? When he's photographed a wide variety of men for this book work, he also, I think, always does ask the sitter to say something about their experience of masculinity. And in this case, Edward said, I feel more like a person than a man, so wonder how to fit in with what's expected of socially constructed gender tropes. Now, I mean, I could have made a speaking of saying that it was entirely about Paul McDonald's work and entirely about Study of Self, because I just.
But I think you and I would probably agree with that statement, in on either side of our, or at least I would. I agree with that. Like, I don't know how I'm supposed to fit into being a man. other than the fact that I have a
That's why
penis.
I think that this work is quite interesting in context of what we're talking about, because actually what happens is study of self becomes maybe kind of like a manual that might be by a man, but is also giving a voice to men talking about what it means to be a man now.
Mm-hmm.
And again, for fear of getting into horrible trouble with all kinds of different groups of people, I do wonder now if we've forgotten that to champion humanity, we can champion masculinity.
What is the advantage of having masculinity and femininity being tropes at all?
Oh,
Do you think there needs to be these things, or do you think things
no,
are just like built up power structures?
I don't think there needs to be. I think they're constructed social kind of conventions, of course, but that doesn't negate the fact that they do exist, and to not scrutinize them, to not interrogate them, is actually incredibly silly.
Yes, but I feel like sometimes I feel like interrogating them, and sometimes I feel like doing analysis, too deep an analysis of them, gives them solidity and power that I don't know that they should have. It assumes that they should exist, I feel like.
But isn't it interesting that we have a culture that is entirely built on a patriarchal system, and yet there is no real inquiry into what the masculinity is? This is like the thing that I just find that so interesting, that we are aware of patriarchal structure of society that stretches way back into our early modern history. Before that, no question that simply because of our gender, we had different roles
Sure.
as we were socially evolving, even way back. But I mean, I'm talking about early modern history, and then into the last 500 years of human life. We see a structure that is absolutely masculinized. It's a masculine culture, it's a patriarchal culture, and yet where in art, which is the funnel point of what culture is, where do we see an inquiry into that masculinity without it being latent?
I think that some people would say that it's assumed due to the fact that it is the norm. I don't know that I don't think that that's necessarily right. I also wondered if there's a difference between a patriarchy. Does a patriarchy need to be masculine? And are those things that closely related?
No, I mean, there's lots of things I'm sure that we would pick apart in this. There are so many highly educated people talking in a much more specialized and informed way than I can speak to this now. But it just seems that from a very kind of basic amateur layman's point of view, that I look across a wide art history and I see art that is made by men, and I see forms that are often of men, but more I see forms of women that are made by men to pleasure men. But when I think about where are the men that help me understand, or that assure
what it
me
means to be a man,
that there is some inquiry into what it actually means to be a man,
do you think women think about what it means to be feminine? I mean, we've had that conversation where you claim that I say that you're feminine all the time, which again, mostly I'm just trying to come to terms. I'm trying to define what it is that you see as particularly feminine, because I think there's other people who might use different terms to describe it. So sometimes I wonder, I don't know.
It's a really, really good article that's frighteningly erudite, and it's by Tori Akers from 2019.
Okay.
I can't remember if it's in Art Forum or somewhere. But the title of the essay is "What is Masculinity in Art, and Do We Have to Care?" And there's quite a few things that I've kind of taken from
it, yeah.
from that. One of them is that Tori Akers writes as a quote themselves, saying in the book Female Masculinity, queer theorist Jack Halberstam suggests that masculinity becomes legible where and when it leaves the white male middle class body. And that to me is kind of emblematic of the kind of the discourses around masculinity aren't really found in those white male middle class bodies at all, and instead there has to be something other in order to direct that inquiry. And
what is the other in that case?
Well, Tori Akers goes on to say that, for example, masculinity, or in context of masculinity, queer artists subvert it, artists of color affirm it, and women artists interrogate it. And I thought
it's interesting to me, because if I think about, say, queer women artists interrogating masculinity, it's interesting because, like, if I said it's a bunch of male artists interrogating what femininity means, women would just be like, what are you talking about? How could you possibly know what femininity means? How could you even describe it? And why would that be better than what the women are saying?
But isn't that the thing again in this, is that we have an overwhelm of male culture, but we don't have necessarily a scrutiny of that culture, or more, we don't have the scrutiny, as we've already said, of the masculinity that feeds into that male culture.
Yeah.
I'm probably not articulating this particularly well, but just...
Well, we're both very sick, so...
We're sick.
We're both very sick.
Yeah, we are. Totally.
We're like, so what do you want? No, go ahead. Sorry.
Speak for yourself, Bill. I have to say, I can really feel like my chest is so heavy. And every time I want to say something, I'm very aware that like the words are coming out, but there has to be like quite a gasp at the end of it.
You have to breathe to get air back in to keep going.
Yeah. It's like actually conscious, which is a weird way to breathe.
Do you see this? Do you see a cowboy smoking a cigarette, riding a horse as masculine?
Well, I mean, Marlboro didn't they?
Sure. Every man wants to be a cowboy. I was never, I can't stand Westerns and stuff, so this does nothing for me,
But isn't this why the hook of the cowboy was picked up by Prince anyway? You know, you've got something that is an icon of American masculine culture that is, again, this idea of something that's overt or something that's kind of covert, a sleeper cell of information. You know, advertising.
Or an aspirational image, right? I mean, everyone wants to be this guy. Every woman wants to be Sarah Jessica Parker in the Sex and the City show, right?
Do they?
I don't know. Well, that's the thing. I don't want to be this guy, but people put it up as an example, and here I am. I'm a man, and this does nothing for me.
I know, but then we have to think about context, don't we? And I think Prince is the expert really at taking things out of context and recontextualizing them through the rephotographing or the appropriation of certain images. And it is true to say that actually the Marlboro Man is the epitome of a particular time, place, era is a better word, that defined a kind of American masculinity from the 20th century. And that though you, Bill Wadman, might not subscribe to notions of the Wild West and cowboys in order to get your fix of what it means to be a man, I think for a lot of people kind of looking in at this, they would find a form and a figure that was highly appealing, and you've used the word aspirational.
Sure.
But to scrutinize it for what it's worth is the thing that I think makes all of this valid, interesting.
Go ahead.
No, just as a modern audience, I'm not sure that we are yet asking kind of the equalitarian questions.
You ever hear somebody try to describe, even a biologist, describe what life is? And they have a really hard time doing it because the definition of life is very vague at the ground level. It's like, well, everyone knows something that's living when they see it, but like, what does that mean? Well, it replicates. Well, there's these weird things that aren't alive that replicate them. The crystals replicate themselves. Does that count? Well, no. It's actually it's a sexual thing because two things in chromosomes. Well, this other kind of life uses RNA, so it doesn't actually choose from two things. Like, you can always find an excuse. I wonder if trying to grasp concepts like masculinity and femininity, the more you actually try to grab them, the more the sand slips through your fingers.
Is it diminished?
Like, we all know it when we see it. We see this image, but if we start tearing the image apart, it falls apart.
Is it diminishing, though, that we seem to broadly as a culture understand what it means to be a woman?
Do we?
No, but I mean, isn't this the myth?
Sure. But I think it is a myth.
Right. But nonetheless, our myths are the kind of, they're embedded in our symbols and our cultural codifications and how we then interpret the world around us. What it means to be a man, I have absolutely no handle on what it means to be a man any more than you might have a handle on what it means to be a woman. But nonetheless, we are both bombarded with images that try to tell us something, yet the inquiry into femaleness or femininity is much broader in its scope, perhaps, than the very narrow slice of what it seems to be in terms of cultural inquiry into what it means to actually be a man. And
I think you can go one step deeper and get meta about it and say that to some extent, the qualifications that make one a man also make it difficult for men to communicate to other men what it means to be a man. In the sense that fathers in this case are really bad at communicating with sons. and some of that comes from an awkwardness about relationships and being vulnerable, and those things sort of make it so that society doesn't discuss manliness. This is a conversation a lot of people have nowadays about, young boys in society and what it means to be a man and getting rid of toxic masculinity, because maybe that's where all of that happens, because people aren't smart enough or open enough to actually have these discussions. I'm saying that maybe it's like one level deeper, and being a man actually makes it harder to analyze what being a man is because of the traits.
Or maybe that's an excellent ruse that white male middle class men have got to try and give themselves a prop to justify their ineptitude at actually analyzing what makes them such assholes in broader culture.
Maybe.
I don't know.
Seems like you're saying it to me. I don't think
I'm not Bill Wadman. I would never say such a thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's an awkward, complicated. None of these subjects are easily analyzed in a way that actually, because no matter what you come up with, there will be people who disagree with your analysis.
Well, also, of course, we're dealing with this in such a totally binary way. And there would have to be a much longer conversation that would be connected, but could also be entirely separate, about what it simply means to be human, but not just that, what it actually means to live a life of no identification, or things that I would probably struggle to speak to, because I am aware of my conditions and I understand the nature of my alignment with my birth gender, and that, luckily, for me, it's entirely plain sailing to be a woman, to be born in a woman's body.
Or is that just something you learned from a very young age, and that's why it feels comfortable to you?
Well, indeed, like I said, that's another like 10 episodes, isn't it?
Sure. Yeah.
Anyway, Bill Wadman, are you comfortable saying that you're a man?
Yes.
Are you comfortable speaking to what it means to be a man?
No,
Right.
but I do really want a Marlboro cigarette now.
Stinky.
Oh God, I would never smoke. It's disgusting. A lot of people in the UK smoke and vape. It's amazing to me. What's wrong with your peoples? They're all like got their little baby bottle in their mouth all day long. Gross.
Bye, Bill.
Bye, Sandy.